I often get asked questions about how to read hallmarks. It's absolutely vital in antique silver to have a decent understanding of what a hallmark looks like, whether it's silver or whether it's not silver, and more importantly, why does silver get hallmarked? Well, it's very straightforward. It's a lot more straightforward than I think a lot of people think. To start off with, silver was, up until 1920 in the United Kingdom and somewhat later in America, silver was literally money. These coins here are Georgian money. They're pretty well worn, and they're made out of exactly the same alloy that these spoons are made from. In fact, they're made from the same alloy that all of English silver is made from, which is 92.5% silver and 7.5% other metals. And when you changed your valuable and hard-earned currency into silver objects, you wanted to be absolutely certain that the silversmith who did the conversion, turning your coins into, in this example, a spoon, you wanted to be absolutely certain that he didn't cheat you. Since we know that silver was quite literally money, if you want to be absolutely certain that things that don't look like money, that might look like spoons or teapots or something else, are of the same quality as the money, given that you have had to pay good money for it, you want to be absolutely certain that you've got what you paid for. That's why the Worshipful Company of Goldsmiths exists. It's really an organisation there to stop fraud. Now, the Goldsmiths' Hall is the authority that is in charge of testing the metal. Now, what they would do is you take your goods to the Goldsmiths' Hall. They would take a little scrape off the object in order to test it. It's difficult to see where they scrape it on a spoon because the manufacturers will have polished it out, but I've got here a teapot that should make it a bit more obvious. See, on here you can see just under the mark, under the top mark here, that there are horizontal lines where a stylus has been used to scratch off just a tiny amount of metal, which they then use to test. They'll work out from that tiny amount of metal whether it's up to the right standard. On the example of a teapot, they haven't bothered to polish away what's known as an assay scrape. On most silver, that assay scrape's long gone. It'll have been polished because it disfigures the object. So when you go into the Goldsmiths' Hall with your spoons that you've made for your customers, they will take a tiny little scrape off them. They'll test that little tiny scraping for the alloy to make sure it's up to the right standard. And only then will they apply a mark to the back of the object or the bottom of the object or wherever they might want to put it. And then you can sell it. Up until the point that an object has a silver hallmark on it, a British hallmark, it's not legal to sell it as silver at all. All you can describe it as is white metal. So hallmarks are terribly important, not just to give certainty that the alloy is correct, but in order to sell it at all. Now, there are vast quantities, as you can imagine, of English silver hallmarks, let alone British silver hallmarks, let alone the whole world. So just for the sake of brevity, really, let's stick to just English hallmarks, for now just London-made objects, which constitute the vast majority actually of antique English silver. Here we've got a London-made spoon, and I can very quickly run through the marks. The system of hallmarking is more or less the same from the beginning of the Tudor period up to the present day. There are slight variations, but we'll get to those as we go. Now, on this spoon, for example, the first mark we see on the left-hand side is what's known as the maker's mark or sponsor's mark. This mark relates to the person in whose name the object is being taken to the assay office. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the person who quite literally made it, but it's the person who's responsible for it. So if it doesn't come up to standard, in other words, it's the person who the Goldsmiths' Hall will go and knock on the door of. So in this case, you can see there's a pair of initials here. On this spoon it's HB, which stands for Hester Bateman, who was a very successful owner of a silversmithing business which she inherited from her husband and turned it around and made it into one of the best silversmithing businesses in London. But that's another story. Moving along, we've got what's called a lion passant or lion passant, which looks like a lion that's just running along. That mark indicates sterling silver. That is the specific standard mark for English silver, and it isn't only in London, it is used in all the towns up and down the country wherever there's an assay office. The next mark along, that is a leopard's face with a crown on. Now that leopard's face with a crown on was used as a London hallmark way back in the 1350s. And the leopard lost his crown latterly, but he's still in use today. And then we come to the date letter, which in this case is a little lowercase n. The series for that starts in 1776 with an A, so the N is 1788. Every single year since the beginning of the Tudor period has had its own date letter. They're not always consistent, in other words A, B, C, D, E, but every single year will have its own identifiable letter so that you can get down to 12 months of its manufacture. Interestingly enough, it doesn't run from January to January. Being rather quirky, the goldsmiths run from the 19th of May to the 18th of May, which is the feast day of St. Dunstan, who was the patron saint of goldsmiths. The last mark here is what they call a duty mark, which is essentially a tax mark to show that the tax has been paid. That mark only appears in 1781. Before 1781, there are only 4 hallmarks, including the sponsor's mark. After 1781, there are 5. But in 1890, that mark disappears again. So for 110 years odd, you get a duty mark. Outside those periods, you don't. All these slight changes to hallmarking, once you've learnt them, are actually really quite helpful, because it means you can stare at this spoon very quickly and identify straight away just by the number of marks that it's made between 1781 and 1890. Now, hallmarking might seem terribly complicated and involved, but you have to take my word for it. It isn't. It's actually remarkably straightforward. Once you get into the habit and you understand the systems are absolutely consistent. Not all jurisdictions are as consistent. Some countries seem to be a lot more random, but in Britain, the system is virtually foolproof.